Improvise, adapt, and overcome.
Listen up. The Trump-Xi Beijing summit is being sold like diplomacy, like statecraft, like two heavyweight powers sat down, shook hands, lowered the temperature, and gave the world a little breathing room. Don't buy that. That was not peace. That was two men sitting across a table with Taiwan, Iran, oil, missiles, and global trade laid out between them like live ordnance. Xi didn't come to Beijing to be charming. He came to mark terrain, and the terrain he marked was Taiwan. He told Trump, plain and clean, that Taiwan is the most important issue in the China-U.S. relationship. It's not trade. It's not tariffs. Certainly not fentanyl. It's not Boeing. It's Taiwan. Then he sharpened the blade. He said, Taiwan independence and cross-strait peace are like fire and water. They do not exist. They do not negotiate. They do not live in the same room. That is not diplomatic poetry. That is a warning order. Xi is telling Washington, you want stability with China, then stay inside the lines on Taiwan. You want conflict, then keep arming Taipei like it's an unsinkable aircraft carrier off our coast. And here's where it gets ugly. Trump comes out of the summit and calls Taiwan arms sales a very good negotiating chip. That sentence should make every serious person in Taipei sit up straight, because Taiwan cannot afford to be treated like a poker chip on a table between two great powers. You don't deter China by making Taiwan look negotiable. You deter China by making Taiwan look too expensive to touch. There's a difference. One invites calculation, the other imposes cost. Now, to pivot to Iran. Trump says Xi agreed Iran needs to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Maybe that was said behind closed doors. Maybe it wasn't. Publicly, Beijing gave us fog. China said its position is consistent and clear. That's diplomatic smoke. That's not a commitment. China buys Iranian oil, folks. China has leverage over Tehran. And China also knows America is bleeding attention across theaters: Europe, the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, border security, domestic politics, debt, industrial capacity, ammunition stocks, all of it. Beijing does not need to beat America in a straight fight. It just needs America distracted, divided, and tired. Iran gives China leverage. Taiwan gives Trump leverage. And both men know it. And that's the center of gravity right there. Beijing's play is simple. Make itself useful on Iran, then extract caution from Washington on Taiwan. Not a formal trade. Not some Hollywood backroom betrayal. Something colder, a hesitation, a delay, a softened arms package, a sentence here, a pause there, a we'll review it, we'll see what happens. That's how deterrence erodes. Not always with explosions, sometimes with ambiguity, sometimes with a handshake, sometimes with a leader saying, your survival is a negotiating chip. So what happened in Beijing? Well, a summit happened. A framework was announced. The cameras clicked. The banquet plates were cleared. But underneath all that ceremony, Xi drew a red line around Taiwan. Trump went looking for help on Iran, and China walked out looking more indispensable than it was before. That is the danger. Not that China is 10 feet tall, because it isn't. And not that America is helpless, because it isn't. The danger is that Washington starts confusing transaction with strategy. A deal is not a doctrine, and a summit is not deterrence, and a press conference is not power. Taiwan is watching, Iran is watching, Russia is sure as heck watching, and the PLA is watching. And every one of them is asking the same question. Does America still know what it is willing to fight for? Because if that answer gets blurry, the world gets very loud, very fast. Strategic stability was the headline. Controlled collision was the reality. And the real message out of Beijing was this. China wants Taiwan isolated. Trump wants Iran contained. And Beijing may try to turn one into the price of the other. Welcome to the Carry On Podcast SITREP edition for the week of May 23rd. I am your host, as always, Brad Colbert, the Iceman. And no, you did not black out and miss a week. I missed a week. I have been traveling for the last 2 weeks for work and wasn't in one place long enough to have our weekly conversation. And if you all had a PRC 104 like I do, we could have done the whole thing broadcast over HF, but I digress. We are here this evening to share some of the stories of the week, or weeks in this case. As well as a thought experiment, which I have to say, I really enjoyed the last one. The last one we did was a hypothetical invasion of Iran. And this week we're going to explore a what-if scenario between Beijing and Washington. We're also going to discuss a little history of Taiwan because I think it's very relevant to the overall discussion as we move forward. And if it seems redundant that we are hitting these two consistently, I apologize, but we are coming at them from a different angle. We're also going to nip down to Australia, one of my favorite places on the globe, for the latest on the continuous delays of this U.S.-UK submarine deal. We're going to talk a little bit about Nigerian ISIS operation. They did schwack a pretty high up individual. We'll talk about that. And then we're going to end on Turkey's new, it's an STM extra large unmanned underwater vehicle. It's pretty cool. Before we wax philosophical on the ways the world is melting down, I do want to give a couple of thank yous and very deserved thank yous. I'd like to start with Overlord 1776, which graciously provided me with a patch and a coin from the Richmond, Kentucky Police Department. The coin's quality is exceptional. I definitely am going to check out where that coin was made because they did an amazing job on that. And I will have Miss Anna send out a photo of the patch that he included on my patch collection board. And I'll also include a photo of the coins where his is now nesting. I also want to give listener Craig huge thank you for the care package that he sent the show. A very nice shirt, which I am wearing this evening for the broadcast, and fits great. Quality is good. I really appreciate that. That was a very generous gift. He also included 2 Louis Royo collected works. Now, if you didn't know from the last AMA that we did, or maybe you don't remember, Louis Royo is a Spanish illustrator, and it is where I've drawn all the inspiration for my artwork on my back, which I'm not taking my shirt off, but is entirely covering my back. So a lot of his pieces on there. No, he is not the individual that inks them, but his artwork is forever memorialized on my back. So he also included, in addition to that, a amazing bottle of Balvenie, Doublewood 12-year-old. And it remains unopened for a really good reason. We are going to include that bottle on the next Whiskey and Bullshit episode, which comes up in 2 weeks, maybe a little longer. We got to do some editing after. But if you're not tracking, we are going to have Tony Aspera from Generation Kill in the studio here for a live one-on-one. We'll do some interviews. We'll do some stories, a little bit of whiskey tasting. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be a great one to watch for. So look out for that. Lastly, but certainly not least, a very welcome aboard to 2 new Patreon members, Dustin and Kenji. Dustin and Kenji, thank you both for supporting the show. Glad to have your support and trust. I really appreciate the conversation. And for those of you who have been faithfully supporting us, continue to watch out for your sticker packs, your t-shirts, and your signed prints, depending on your tier. We continually send those out, so keep an eye out and then let us know. Make sure you got it. Okay. Let's start out with a little history of Taiwan before we do our invasion thought experiment. This is going to be a deep dive. So make sure that your glass is full. Don't worry. I'll wait, pause, come back. It is a historical look at Taiwan. I have mine glass for the evening. Another hot toddy. I am still battling a sore throat. And this is definitely helping. Delicious. So Taiwan, obviously it's an island, but there's a lot of history involved with this island. There's a lot of history involved with its association with the United States, with China, heck, with the rest of the world, right? So historically, Taiwan is a layered island, indigenous Austronesian homeland, Qing frontier, Japanese colony, Republic of China refuge, Cold War bastion, democratized high-tech state, and now the central pressure point between the United States primacy and China's national rejuvenation project. Taiwan's current crisis is not just about whether Beijing owns Taiwan. It is about whether force can rewrite political identity, maritime geography, alliance credibility, and let's not forget the global semiconductor economy, which Taiwan firmly controls. Taiwan today functions as a de facto independent democratic state. It elects its leaders, it controls territory, has its own military, currency, passport, and legal system, but it lacks broad formal diplomatic recognition because most countries recognize Beijing as the government of China. Reuters summarizes the core reality fairly cleanly. It said that Taiwan has been governed separately since 1949. Only 12 countries maintain formal diplomatic ties with Taipei, and Washington recognizes Beijing diplomatically while maintaining unofficial ties with Taiwan and supporting Taiwan's self-defense under the Taiwan Relations Act. So the strategic implication here is very brutal. Taiwan's history created a lot of ambiguity. China's rise is trying to end that ambiguity, and the United States is trying to preserve it without triggering a great power war. So Taiwan matters for 5 reasons. First, geography. Taiwan sits off China's coast between Japan and the Philippines along the first island chain. Whoever controls Taiwan gains leverage over the East China Sea, South China Sea, Luzon Strait, and the Western Pacific access. Taiwan's offshore islands, Kinmen, Matsu, and Penghu, no, I'm not pronouncing them right, are not map trivia. All of these islands are tripwires. They have forward sensors, they're political symbols, and they're massive military liabilities. Second is identity. Taiwan's population has evolved away from the old Chinese Civil War frame. Beijing sees Taiwan as unfinished civil war. Many Taiwanese see themselves as already self-governing and not subordinate to the People's Republic of China. Now, that identity shift is the fuse. Third, semiconductors. Taiwan is not just an island. It is a strategic manufacturing node. A Taiwan crisis is going to hit, and we've talked about this, chips, shipping, insurance, energy, finance, and global manufacturing all at once, mostly because these semiconductors that they make are included in everything. Number 4, U.S. credibility. Washington does not formally promise to defend Taiwan, but it is legally committed to help Taiwan defend itself. That's an interesting paradox. That right there is strategic ambiguity, and it's useful until the shooting starts. Number 5, China's legitimacy. For Xi Jinping and the CCP, Taiwan is not merely territory, it is regime mythology. National rejuvenation is incomplete without it. That makes compromise very, very difficult and miscalculation dangerous. Let's get into the history a little bit. It's important, I think. Indigenous Taiwan before China, before Japan, before the ROC, Taiwan's oldest human story is not Chinese nationalist history. It begins with indigenous Austronesian peoples whose linguistic and genetic connections reach across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Austronesian refers to a massive and geographically widespread family of language, as well as the people who speak them. Numbering something around 400 million people, these maritime pioneers, if you will, they originated in Taiwan. They spread across the islands of the Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. And this took place over thousands of years. And yes, I looked this up on Wikipedia. You're welcome. All of this matters because Beijing's Taiwan has always been China claim. It compresses a much more complicated reality. The island was not historically governed like an ordinary Chinese province for most of imperial history. It was a maritime frontier where people traded with, migrated to, fought over, taxed unevenly, and was only gradually absorbed into the Qing administrative structures. And the implication is that Taiwan's history here, it's not clean. There's no title deed history. It's purely frontier history. And anyone telling you it is a simple ancient possession is selling you modern doctrine, not history, okay? If you go back to the Qing frontier of the 1600s to the 1800s, so in the 1600s, Taiwan became part of a wider contest among Dutch, Spanish, Chinese, Japanese, and indigenous powers. The Dutch East India Company controlled parts of southwestern Taiwan from 1624 until 1662. There's no test. I told you this was going to be a deep dive, but context is important. Spain briefly held northern Taiwan. Then Qinggong expelled the Dutch and established a Ming loyalist base. So the Qing dynasty eventually defeated the heirs, incorporated Taiwan in 1683, but Qing control remained uneven for a very long time. In fact, much of Taiwan was treated as a frontier zone. The Han migration increased. A lot of conflict with indigenous communities intensified, and this island slowly became more administratively integrated. And fast forward to 1885, Taiwan was made a Qing province. And that was late in Chinese history, and I think that matters because the implication here is Beijing's claim rests partly on Qing-era sovereignty, but Taiwan's direct provincial integration into China was very brief before Japan took it. Between 1895 and after the end of World War II. After the Qing defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War, Taiwan is ceded to Japan under the 1895 treaty. Taiwan remained under Japanese colonial rule until the end of World War II. Taiwan's own government portal notes that the Republic of China was founded in 1912 while Taiwan was still under Japanese colonial rule as a result of an 1895 treaty. Japan completely transformed Taiwan, adding railways, public health system, police, administration, a formal education system, big into sugar production, built ports, made a massive wartime industrialization. It also imposed colonial hierarchy, a lot of assimilation pressure to come into the fold of Japan, a lot of repression and imperial extraction. So Taiwan was modernized, but it wasn't liberated. And to be fair, modernization came under occupation. So the implication here is that Japanese rule created a lot of institutions and infrastructure that really helped shape modern Taiwan. It also separated Taiwan's political development from mainland China for the better part of half a century. And that is one reason Taiwan's post-World War II identity diverged from the PRC's, People's Republic of China, revolutionary state-building experience. Okay, 1945 to 1949, ROC takeover and the Civil War relocation. In 1945, Japanese surrenders. We all know that. That's history. Taiwan was placed under Republic of China administration. In 1949, after losing the Chinese Civil War to Mao Zedong's communist forces, the ROC government retreats to Taiwan. Mao founded the People's Republic of China on the mainland and claimed to be the legitimate government of all of China, including Taiwan. Reuters lays out the modern rupture here. So Taiwan became a Japanese colony in 1895, was handed over to the ROC after World War II, and in 1949, the ROC government flees to Taiwan after defeat by the Chinese Communist forces. And that's, so this is the core unresolved issue here, folks. The People's Republic of China has never ruled Taiwan, but claims secession to China, and therefore claims Taiwan. The ROC has governed Taiwan since 1945, 1949, but lost most of that international recognition after Beijing took China's UN seat in 1971. So Taiwan is not merely separatist. The polity on Taiwan is the surviving ROC state structure after a civil war that never ended in a peace treaty. So for decades, Taiwan was ruled under martial law by Kuomintang. The ROC claimed to represent all China. We're going back a little bit here. U.S. backs Taiwan during the Cold War as part of this huge containment against communism. Like I said, Taiwan's had a very tumultuous history going back thousands of years. The island becomes, during the Cold War, this hardened anti-communist fortress and an economic development success story. But the cost was political repression. The White Terror, surveillance, imprisonment of dissidents, suppression of local Taiwanese identity, and a one-party rule. Then came democratization. Martial law ends in 1987. A lot of opposition politics grow. Direct presidential elections in Taiwan begins in 1996. Think about that. That's pretty recent. Taiwan evolves from authoritarian anti-communist outpost into this current liberal democracy. So Taiwan's democratic legitimacy, it's now central to a lot of its strategic value because Beijing is not just facing an offshore island. It is facing a Chinese-speaking democracy that completely disapproves the CCP's argument that Chinese culture requires one-party rule. That's why Taiwan is ideologically dangerous to Beijing. It has this sovereignty problem. Beijing's position says Taiwan is part of China and that reunification is a historical necessity. The People's Republic of China's 2022 white paper says it was released to reiterate that Taiwan is part of China, to demonstrate the CCP and Chinese people's resolve and emphasize Beijing's policy in the new era. China's anti-secession law states that both of the mainland and Taiwan belong to one China, and says the state will not allow Taiwan independence forces to make Taiwan secede under any name or means. Beijing's legal trigger here is deliberately vague. If you go back to 2005 anti-secession law in China, it gives China a domestic legal basis for force if Taiwan secedes or if peaceful reunification possibilities are completely exhausted. Reuters notes the law gives China a legal basis for military action, but doesn't really provide any precise details on how that's supposed to happen. If I was to translate it, I would say Beijing wants maximum coercive flexibility. It wants Taiwan afraid. It wants the United States to be uncertain, and it wants regional states to be very hesitant. So Taiwan's position is their current government says the ROC/Taiwan is completely sovereign, and that the People's Republic of China has never ruled Taiwan. And they're not wrong. They're not wrong. I mean, we talked about the dates, dry and boring that it is. And we talked about the path that Taiwan started on and ended up on. And honestly, current communist China never ruled Taiwan. Taiwan's president has repeatedly said that the ROC and PRC are not subordinate to each other, which Beijing interprets as completely separatist framing. Reuters notes that Taiwan's president's position is that their country is already independent under the ROC framework. Not that he is pushing an immediate constitutional declaration of a new Republic of Taiwan. And I think that matters because a formal declaration of independence would be very legally and politically difficult in Taiwan. It would require constitutional amendment procedures, legislative thresholds, referendum dynamics, not just a presidential speech. So Taiwan's practical strategy right now is to preserve de facto independence without crossing Beijing's, formal red line, which will force hands. I think they would like that. The U.S. position here is intentionally engineered ambiguity. It goes all the way back to the Carter administration. Washington recognizes Beijing as the government of China, and it maintains unofficial relations with Taiwan. Now, we don't formally recognize Taiwan as an independent country. We don't support Taiwanese independence. And as far as I can find, we oppose any unilateral changes to the status quo. But this is the rub. The United States is also bound by the Taiwan Relations Act to provide Taiwan with defensive means, which we've been doing. In fact, Reuters summarizes that the United States severed official ties with Taipei in favor of Beijing back in 1979, but remains bound by the TRA to provide Taiwan the means to defend itself. So the United States officially, we take no position on Taiwan's sovereignty under its one China policy. All of these are complicated issues, but the 6 assurances matter because they tell Taiwan Washington has not agreed to set a date to end arms sales, and it hasn't agreed to consult Beijing before arms sales. It's not agreed to revise the Taiwan Relations Act. All of this means America is trying very hard to deter China without giving Taiwan a blank check. We're trying to reassure Taiwan without formally recognizing independence. And that balancing act right now, it's under a lot of fucking strain. The current environment is China is normalizing military pressure. In fact, China now sends aircraft and ships near Taiwan regularly. We've talked about it. Reuters reported that back in April, China's defense ministry called its regular military activities around Taiwan entirely justified and reasonable, while Taiwan condemns the near daily presence of Chinese warships and warplanes around their island. It's not random harassment. It is a campaign, and it is trying to normalize this military pressure. I would say Beijing is trying to accomplish 5 things all at the same time. They're training the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, for real contingencies. They're trying to wear down Taiwan's air and naval readiness. They're making military pressure feel normal. They're certainly testing the United States and Japanese response thresholds. Yeah. And the last one is they're conditioning the world to accept Chinese presence around Taiwan as completely routine. In some countries, it's working. Not all. Taiwan's defense ministry describes this PRC gray zone activity as aerial and maritime incursions, a lot of cyber attacks, cognitive warfare, all of this designed to test and deplete readiness, as well as increase psychological intimidation. The gray zone it's not below war in this context. This is pre-war shaping. We're going to talk about this in the next segment, but the blockade scenario, I think, is the more likely scenario than a, World War II Normandy style invasion. A full amphibious invasion of Taiwan would be probably one of the most difficult military operations in modern history, being conducted by an army that's never been battle tested. It requires massive amounts of air superiority, sea control, missile suppression, logistics. You got to have a perfect weather window, beaches, ports, airborne and air assault operations, not to mention political endurance under massive losses. You got to sell it at home. That's why I think a blockade is the most likely approach here, because a blockade is different. It lets Beijing apply pressure without immediately betting the regime on this catastrophic beach landing. CSIS ran 26 wargame iterations of a Chinese blockade of Taiwan and emphasized that such a blockade could disrupt global trade, escalate into major Western Pacific conflict, and generate convoy battles reminiscent of World War II. Which, pretty big. The CSIS wargame explored a lot of different scenarios, ranging from Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia boarding ships to a much wider war involving attacks on the United States and Japanese forces. In some iterations, Taiwan's electricity production fell to 35% of peacetime levels, and Taiwan and United States efforts to restore cargo flows came at severe cost. You're going to have to break the blockade, including more than probably in their wargame scenarios, 100 merchant ships and major aircraft and warship losses. So all of this is to say the most dangerous near-term scenario is probably not some D-Day across the strait. I would expect it to look more like quarantine, customs inspection, and an exclusion zone, a lot of cyber, cable cutting. We've talked about them surveying undersea cables in some of the last episodes, port intimidation, energy squeeze, and a political ultimatum. I'm sorry. Did I not segue into the thought experiment? I'm being told that I did not cleanly separate. The history of Taiwan is over. We are now moving our way into what is going to happen if the United States and Taiwan were to trade blows. How would it play out? So that's what we're discussing. I think the overwhelming majority opinion is that China's not going to do a massive amphibious landing. It comes at far too high of a cost across the board. I mean, militarily, politically, economically. So blockades. is the most likely. It gives Beijing escalation control. It also gives Washington a really shitty choice, because do we break the blockade and risk war, or do we watch Taiwan slowly suffocate? And we'll find out. Taiwan's economy is a huge strategic asset here and a hostage. Their semiconductor sector makes it absolutely indispensable, but that indispensability cuts both ways. It deters war because a Taiwan conflict would wreck global supply chains, but it also makes Taiwan a target because control, denial, or disruption of all of these Taiwanese chip ecosystems would totally reshape technological power. The Taiwan Strait itself, massive global trade artery. CSIS reports that more than 1/5 of all maritime commerce passes through the Taiwan Strait. 1/5. So a Taiwan crisis is not a regional military story. This is a global economic shock event. I mean, you're going to see insurance rates spike. Shipping is going to have to be rerouted. LNG, that's liquefied natural gas. All of those flows will tighten. And of course, the semiconductor supply chains will absolutely be frozen. A lot of the Asian markets would convulse. U.S. tech manufacturing would take a huge hit. China's economy is going to get hurt here too. But when it comes to authoritarian systems like China, sometimes they are willing to accept a lot of economic pain for political objectives. Most of the free world is not willing to do that, and that's the trap here. Everyone will lose, but not everyone calculates loss the same way. Certainly not Beijing. Taiwan's domestic politics are strategically consequential, let's say. Taiwan is not a monolith. The Democratic Progressive Party tends to emphasize Taiwanese sovereignty and a lot of the identity, while the Kuomintang favors a lot more engagement with China, but they also want to preserve the ROC framework. Then there's the Taiwanese People Party. They've complicated the political math because they appeal to voters that are very tired of the old blue-green polarization. And I think this matters because Taiwan's defense budgets, as well as their civil defense reforms, their reserve mobilization, energy resilience, and arms procurement, all can become trapped in their partisan gridlock. ISW noted that back in May, Taiwan's special defense budget remained stalled due to a lot of this partisan gridlock. And this is all despite U.S. pressure. And we talked about it in one of the previous episodes. It's a strategic vulnerability because Taiwan cannot ask the world to risk blood and treasure for its survival while it treats defense reform like a domestic bargaining chip. So if Taiwan really wants deterrence, then it has to look like a country that is taking steps to prepare for their own survival, not just a democracy arguing over a lot of their budgets while the wolf is mapping the fence. We're going to do a couple of DIME analysis here. If you're not familiar with that, it's an acronym, diplomacy, information, military, and economy. So starting with diplomacy, Taiwan's diplomatic space, it's narrow, but it's not dead. Taiwan has a few formal allies, but deep unofficial relationship with the United States, Japan, Europe, Australia, and others. Beijing is using a lot of diplomatic isolation as pressure. Poaching recognition, blocking Taiwan from international organizations, framing Taiwan participation as separatism. The United States wants to preserve the status quo. Japan sees Taiwan as directly tied to its own southwestern defense. Philippines Philippines matter because Luzon sits near Taiwan's southern approaches. And Europe cares more than it used to because now Taiwan is tied to chips and trade and coercion norms. Currently, Taiwan's survival depends less on formal recognition and more on, let's call it operationalized partnerships. So talking about things like weapons deliveries, a lot of intelligence sharing, logistics access, cyber, maritime, sanctions planning, joint crisis, all of this. Diplomacy that does not translate into readiness right now, pure theater. Currently, China's information campaign that they're wielding has, three focuses of effort or three lines. They're touting the historical inevitability pretty hard. They're saying that Taiwan has always been China. Secondly, stowing fear that United States support for Taiwan will get Taiwan destroyed and that resistance is futile, right? Resistance is pointless. Reunification is inevitable. Taiwan's counter message is democracy, self-rule, and you're not in charge of us, non-subordination to the PRC. But Taiwan has a lot of internal vulnerabilities, at least on the media front, right? As I said, there's party polarization. There's a lot of Chinese influence operations, like a lot. There's a lot of cyber intrusion and social trust. And this whole information battlefield, this begins before a blockade. Beijing wants Taiwan psychologically softened before the first missile fires. The objective is not just to defeat Taiwan's military, really. It's to convince Taiwan's public that no one's coming to save them and that resistance is hopeless and that surrender is rational. That is why civil defense and public communication and government credibility really matter as much as the missiles. So on the military, in the DIME acronym, the People's Liberation Army, they have options, a lot of them actually. Gray zone pressure, which we've talked about. Offshore island seizure, there's a few. Of course, the maritime quarantine, they could do a full blockade. They could do just a missile and air campaign. I would imagine all of that's going to be accompanied by a cyber and electronic attack. They could try for a decapitation strike on the government. They could do an amphibious invasion or a combined blockade invasion sequence. They've got options. Now, on the defenders front, Taiwan's defense problem, it's ugly, but it's not hopeless. Taiwan does not need to really defeat China in a symmetrical war. They wouldn't. It just needs to deny a very quick success, much like Ukraine's model against Russia. You want to keep command and control alive, preserve ports and runways where possible, disperse your forces, harden your infrastructure, mine the approaches. Any landing forces that show up, you hit them and you hit them hard. You just survive long enough for international pressure or intervention. Looking at Taiwan's 2025 Quadrennial Defense Review, it says PRC gray zone activities include aerial and maritime incursions, joint exercises, cyber attacks, and cognitive warfare, and that the People's Liberation Army capabilities can impose aerial and maritime blockades that may rapidly transition into evasion. That's a direct quote. I think that Taiwan should prioritize a lot of asymmetric survivability, and they know this too. Talking about things like mobile anti-ship missiles, air defense, mines, drones, hardened comms, a lot of fuel reserves, organize a civil defense, learn how to do rapid runway repair, a lot of distributed logistics and territorial resilience. I think the prestige platforms matter less than kill chains that survive any first contact. Looking at the economy, China is Taiwan's largest threat, but also historically one of its major economic counterparts. That independence used to be a stabilizer, and now it is a very coercive channel. Taiwan has some vulnerabilities. Energy imports. They bring in everything. I mean, really everything. There's very little that is domestically produced. It does not have the natural resources that I'm sure that they would like. So energy is imported, food is imported, a lot of undersea cables that connect their country with the rest of the world in the same ways, most of us are, right? Port access, semiconductor is concentrated. We talked about that with our interview with Dr. Moore a little while back. They have a lot of insurance and shipping exposure, and their political dependence on trade confidence is pretty high. So they do have some vulnerabilities, but so does China. China's vulnerabilities are export dependence, energy imports. They bring a lot of it in too. They have a lot of financial exposure, sanctions risk. That is something that they're very vulnerable for. Maritime choke points, domestic economic fragility, artificially propping up their yen, their currency. Sorry, I said yen. That's not the right one. I think that a Taiwan crisis is going to become economic warfare almost immediately. The first shots are probably going to be legal notices, bullshit customs rules, and then go to work with the cable disruptions, followed by cyber attacks, closing ports, a lot of insurance withdrawals, market panic. I think all of those are opening salvos, not missile. Taiwan is the CCP's unfinished sacred task. Xi cannot casually abandon reunification rhetoric because it is wired into his legitimacy, into the country's nationalism, into military modernization. We've talked about this ad nauseum. He's got to have Taiwan back in the fold. But invading Taiwan and failing would be, I would say, regime threatening. I think China's most likely preference is a lot of coercive surrender without invasion. You isolate Taiwan, intimidate them, infiltrate them, exhaust, divide, and then you force negotiations under pressure. It's very similar to what Putin tried to do in Ukraine and failed miserably. In your face, Putin. I think the bottom line here is Beijing wants Taiwan without paying the full price of war, but it is building the option to pay that price if it thinks the window is closing. And we talked about those indicators with Dr. Moore. For Taiwan, the danger for them is not only invasion, it's slow strangulation and a lot of internal paralysis. So Taiwan really needs to make itself indigestible, not symbolically defiant. I'm talking about really materially hard to conquer, very hard to blockade, hard to decapitate, and hardened psychologically. So their priority right now, if I was Taiwan, should be, and in some ways they're getting there, civil defense and national resilience, build those energy and food reserves, increase and decentralize your mobile coastal defenses, make sure you have hardened and redundant comms when those cables get cut. You're going to need drone and counter drone. Learn how to do rapid infrastructure repair and at scale. Huge amount of counter disinformation capacity. They have to come together politically on these survival issues. You can't be polarized. And then you need pre-negotiated crisis coordination with the United States, Japan, and regional partners. Taiwan does not have the luxury of normal politics, folks. This island lives under the shadow of a massive empire with a stopwatch, and they need to realize that nationally, right? For us, for the United States, Taiwan is a test of whether United States deterrence in Asia is real or completely ornamental. But we have a contradiction, as always. We want Taiwan secure. We want China deterred. We want our allies reassured and our trade protected and war avoided, while refusing to say plainly what it would do if China attacks. We haven't. Now, that ambiguity has value, but it also has decay, because if Beijing concludes that Washington is distracted, divided, depleted, or transactional, then our deterrence, it weakens. Recent reporting has already shown concern in Taiwan when U.S. political rhetoric frames Taiwan as a negotiating chip rather than a strategic partner. Associated Press reported that when Trump was at the summit with Xi Jinping, and he made that description of Taiwan-related arms sales as a very good negotiating chip with China, that a lot of anxiety was sparked in Taiwan. And if Washington continues to treat Taiwan like a bargaining chip, all Beijing is hearing is permission. And a lot of our allies is going to hear weakness. Japan is in the kill box whether it wants to be or not. Any Taiwan war is immediately going to pull in Japan, because U.S. bases in Japan are central to any U.S. response. And China knows that. The island chain sits directly along the operational battle space. Yonaguni, it's very close to Taiwan. Okinawa is a major U.S. military hub. And so Japan cannot separate Taiwan's security from Japanese homeland security. A Taiwan contingency is a Japanese contingency. Philippines, they're back on the strategic map because of northern Luzon. It faces Taiwan's southern approaches. U.S. access agreements with Philippines basing complicates a lot of Chinese planning. So in a Taiwanese crisis, the Luzon Strait becomes a military and logistical artery. I think that Beijing is going to pressure Manila hard. I'm talking diplomatically, economically, and through a lot of maritime coercion, and we're seeing it now. Global markets, any Taiwan crisis would be massive. I mean, the Strait of Hormuz being closed with Iran is big. This one would be bigger. Enormous maritime commerce goes through the Taiwan Strait. Their semiconductor ecosystem is so deeply embedded in AI, defense electronics, not to mention smartphones, servers, vehicles, and just industrial systems across the board. So a blockade or missile campaign, you're talking about triggering a global industrial recession. And the world talks about Taiwan as a sovereignty dispute. No. Markets treat it as a systemic risk note. Yeah. I think there's a couple of different pathways in this crisis. Pathway number one, slow gray zone escalation. So China increases a lot of their air and their naval operations, and they've kind of been doing that. They bump up the cyber attacks, start having more cable incidents, a lot of customs pressure, drone overflights, and then massive influence operations, right? And Taiwan would respond very defensively. The world would adapt, though. And Beijing just shifts the baseline. I think the likelihood of that is very high, and that carries a medium to high risk. The strategic purpose there is you just normalize Chinese operational control around Taiwan. That's what I think is taking place right now. Now, this second pathway, a quarantine or inspection regime. In a scenario like this, China would announce maritime or air safety controls. They would set up an inspection zone or a customs enforcement around Taiwan. Could use the Coast Guard, not U.S., I almost said U.S. Could use their Coast Guard and maritime militia first, which they have a lot, with PLA over the horizon backing. I would rate the likelihood of that as medium high, but it carries a very high risk. The purpose there would be to test whether the United States will physically challenge Chinese coercion. And I don't know what the answer to that is today. I really don't. I want to say that I have a pretty good idea of what we would do, but this administration is just too unpredictable and I can't forecast it. The third pathway is offshore island seizure. That's a scenario where China seizes or blockades a smaller Taiwanese-held island, which would shock Taipei and test us. The likelihood of that is medium, high risk, and the strategic purpose there would create a fait accompli below the threshold of full Taiwanese invasion. Oh, there's another one. That's your full blockade. In this scenario, China would cut Taiwan's trade flows completely and their energy imports. All of this forces political concessions. I give this one a medium likelihood. Risk is very high. Strategically, it coerces surrender without immediate amphibious invasion. Speaking of which, scenario number 5, invasion. Now, in this one, China launches a massive missile strike combined with cyber, air and naval operations, a huge airborne assault, coupled with amphibious landings and probably some decapitation attempts. The likelihood is lower than blockade in the near term, but not low overall. The risk is extreme. The strategic purpose here is you resolve Taiwan by force before political, demographic, or military window shift. It's a lot. It's a lot to think about. Taiwan's history implies the following. The status quo is not static. It is actively moving. I think the history of Taiwan has shown that. Taiwan does not declare independence. China does not invade. This is the old formula here, right? America does not recognize Taiwan, but it will arm it. It worked when China was weaker and when Taiwan politics were less identity-driven and when the United States power looked much less contested. But that's not the world we are living in. Today's world, it's much sharper, it's much clearer. Today, China has the military capacity to impose some pretty serious coercion, and Taiwan has the identity and democratic will to resist absorption. The United States has the interest to deter China, but right now I think we lack the political consistency. Meanwhile, Japan and the Philippines are becoming operationally central. A lot of these semiconductors is going to make the crisis global. And this gray zone warfare that we've talked about, it's already underway. Taiwan is not headed towards resolution. It is headed towards a test. So the question really is whether deterrence, their own resilience, and a lot of diplomacy is going to make that test non-kinetic. I don't think it will. I don't think it. That's an opinion, mind you. But if I'm reading the tea leaves, they're not coming up non-kinetic. The priority recommendation for Taiwan, if you're out there and you're listening, is stop thinking in terms of, will America save us? That is the wrong first question. The first question you should be asking yourself is, can you survive the first 30 to 90 days without a political collapse? You don't have stockpiles of food and water the way that you should. You have not hardened your energy grid. You have not had redundant communications. You need to, no kidding, expand civil defense. The whole country should be in some way prepared to fight behind every blade of grass, right? You need a lot of asymmetric systems. You need them at scale. You have to be able to repair those ports and runways. You should be manufacturing your own drone swarms. Give a call to Zelensky. I hear he's got a guy. Knock off the political partisan obstruction at least on the defense side of the house. You have got to run drills and you have to prepare your public for blockades. Those undersea cables need to be protected and you need to create redundancy. If I was Taiwan, I would make it so costly to isolate, decapitate, or occupy. That's my advice. Now, for the United States, fewer speeches and more logistics. The foreign military sales that we have pending for Taiwan, clear that up. Get it moving. You need to, and we do, in many ways we do, we need to pre-position a lot of these munitions regionally. Guam needs to be hardened. So does Okinawa and the Philippines. A lot of our anti-ship missile depth across the first island chain needs to be increased. We should be doing more joint planning with Japan and the Philippines. I'm sure we do, but I would hope that there's a robust sanctions package that is prepared before this crisis kicks off. I don't know what our convoy or blockade breaking playbook is, but I hope it's out there. I hope we have a COA. I want the political signaling from the United States to be consistent. Stop treating Taiwan as a transactional bargaining chip. This ambiguity that we have, you can preserve it, but only if it's backed up by visible capability. For Japan and for the Philippines, you two need to stop assuming that you are spectators. You also need to harden bases, improve air and missile defense, expand maritime surveillance, plan for civilian evacuation, and probably want to coordinate with the United States before the crisis, not during it. It's a lot. It's a lot. And I'm not Chicken Little. The sky is not falling. But I still have a helmet standing by. Taiwan is the place where a lot of history, geography, democracy, empire, and silicone, they all collide. Beijing sees unfinished reunification. Taipei sees survival and a lot of self-rule. Washington sees deterrence, credibility, and strategic access. Markets, they see shipping and chips. Japan sees its southern flank. Philippines sees the return of geography. And the whole world sees this little small island. Strategists see the lock on the Western Philippines. I think the future of Taiwan will not be decided by history or ancient maps. It's going to be decided by a lot of readiness and endurance and whether Beijing believes the cost of coercion is higher than the reward. And right now, unless you are not paying attention, I would say Beijing is probing. So, yeah. A couple of caveats. Just understand that Taiwan's legal status, it remains contested and heavily so. The one China policy in Washington, it's not the same as Beijing's one China principle. A blockade, I think, is more likely than an immediate full invasion, but it could escalate fast. All of Taiwan's internal political gridlock, this is a real deterrence problem. So any U.S. political signaling, this is going to materially change Beijing's risk calculation. So, yeah, that's sort of the history of Taiwan and a little bit of introduction, if you will, the prologue of a U.S.-China conflict. Okay, let's go a little deeper. Let's talk a little bit about specifically, let's sort of leave Taiwan off to the side here for a moment and discuss a hypothetical conflict between the United States and China. How would it flesh out? We're going to build upon what we've talked about and just explore a little bit about the advantages, disadvantages. What are the anticipated losses? How is it going to play out? It's not going to probably start out with a clean declaration of war. I think that it's most likely going to begin one of the ways we've already talked about, which is a managed crisis that stops being managed. Probably a blockade, but it could very easily be a clash near the Philippines or Semiconductor, a collision at sea, maybe a cyber attack, which could be misread as a preparation for a kinetic strike. There's a lot that can take place with Chinese coercive operations around Taiwan, and that could potentially force the United States to choose between, do we intervene or do we lose credibility? Taiwan is the most likely ignition point, but the war is not going to stay about Taiwan. It would become a regional Indo-Pacific war, which is going to seek, fighting across the Taiwanese Strait, the Philippine Sea, South China Sea, East China Sea. Of course, it's going to be fought in cyber and pretty hard, but it's also going to be in space. Global trade routes, chip supply chains, energy markets, diplomatic forums, whether it's global or whether it's state. And a lot of domestic political systems. Do we have the appetite? Do they have the appetite? I mean, they really don't get a vote in China, but we do. And I don't know what our appetite for that would be. I don't know what the American street would say about a U.S.-China conflict. The U.S. intelligence community assessed back in earlier this year that Beijing probably prefers to set conditions for eventual Taiwan unification much short of war, but also admits the PLA is steadily developing the capability to seize Taiwan and defeat U.S. intervention if ordered. That same intelligence community also assessed that Chinese leaders do not currently have a fixed invasion timeline and do not currently plan to invade Taiwan in 2027. And here's where I disagree. And wow, the hubris that it must take me to disagree with 18 separate intelligence community schoolhouses or organizations in the United States. But yeah, it does. That is my assessment. I am entitled to an opinion. I am entitled to my strategic analysis of the situation, and I disagree, but we'll leave that one alone, right? That same report that was let out earlier this year recognizes that a full amphibious evasion would be extremely difficult, very high risk, and exacerbated by any U.S. intervention. So the center of gravity here, I would say, is this. I think China wants victory without war. We've said that. The U.S. wants deterrence without escalating anything. And Taiwan wants to survive without feeling abandonment. And that triangle, totally unstable. The most plausible U.S.-China war would be a limited war that risks becoming unlimited. Again, this is purely hypothetical here, but I'm basing it off of the assets that we have, assets that they have, the triggers, the tripwires, the indicators. As I said, I think it's going to start out with a quarantine or some kind of blockade, followed by missile intimidation and then cyber, a lot of information warfare. At the same time, legal warfare, huge maritime militia pressure. I'm talking hundreds of vessels, and all of which would conspire for this air and naval encirclement. I think that the People's Liberation Army would probably try to make Taiwan politically buckle long before they need to storm any beaches. A blockade, as far as Beijing is concerned, gives them a lot of escalation control. It puts the burden of first kinetic strike on us. And then it can let China frame itself as basically just enforcing sovereignty rather than starting a war. So for us, that problem is brutal because in order to defend Taiwan, America has to project power into China's missile envelope. Yeah. We did it once before. Well, actually twice, but once before. The PLA's anti-access area denial system is designed to threaten U.S. bases, our carriers, our logistics nodes, satellites, everything. The Pentagon did a a report back in 2025 on China military power, and it states that China's military focus remains the first island chain, and that Beijing sees that region as the strategic center of gravity for its objectives. So this war would therefore not look like Iraq or Afghanistan or even Ukraine for that matter. It's going to look more like a high-speed maritime, air, cyber, space knife fight inside a missile storm. Sharks with laser beams. All right, I made that last one up. With every hour of this carrying the risk of horizontal escalation. There's a couple pathways to war between the United States and China. We've talked about most of them. Blockade under the guise of quarantine. That's the opening move. I think that China would announce restricted sea and air access all around Taiwan. And they're going to come up with some bullshit language of customs control or an exercise, anti-smuggling, right? They can't use denazification because Putin stole that one, but it could use the PLA Navy, Chinese Coast Guard. They have a huge maritime militia like this. It's basically thousands of fishing vessels that they've deputized, for lack of a better word. Huge cyber units. They have missile forces, a lot of IO, and all designed to isolate Taiwan without a full invasion. So we talked about the CSIS war games on the Chinese blockade. Biggest and most intense naval combat since World War II is what those war games turned up. And all of this depends on the United States, Japanese, Taiwanese, and Chinese choices. Beijing would dare Washington to break the blockade. They would. And if the U.S. fires first, then China can claim a victimhood. If we hesitate, Taiwan's confidence will just bleed out. It's a horrible horned dilemma that we're going to get put into. And I know that is going to take place. I know. I don't know, but I theorize. Blockade and then see who blinks first. We talked about a full invasion of Taiwan. I don't see it happening. But if Beijing believes time is starting to turn against it, it could. That's going to require a lot of missile and airstrikes. It's going to require a lot of airborne and seaborne assault. They're going to have to seize ports. They're going to have to seize airfields. They're going to have to suppress Taiwanese command and control networks. And they're going to have to rapidly reinforce across one of the most dangerous bodies of water on Earth. Our U.S. intelligence assessment of the Chinese officials is that they understand an amphibious invasion would be extremely challenging and super high risk, especially if the United States intervenes. And this is why invasion is not Beijing's clean first choice. It is the most dangerous choice. It either wins fast or it bleeds China badly. Another option here would be a U.S.-China C-class clash. Yeah. Probably begin through the Philippines. China has been steadily increasing pressure around a lot of the disputed South China Sea, especially where Philippine vessels operate. That's been huge in the news. The U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, it creates a pathway for an incident involving Philippine forces or, against the Chinese or maritime, their Navy, Coast Guard, militia vessels, doesn't matter. It draws U.S. into support, and then you could escalate. There was a threat assessment in this year saying that China is advancing politically and militarily over claimed territory in the South China Sea through a lot of Coast Guard, diplomatic, and legal action. That's why we do freedom of navigation exercises to, legally dispute China's claim on some of these territories. We know they're building artificial islands. They're creating islands completely from scratch. That scenario is much less likely to produce any full-scale war than Taiwan, but it's still dangerous because it could begin as a very small incident and it becomes a credibility test, especially with this administration who has demonstrated a lot of unpredictability. There's another way we could find ourselves in a kinetic between China, and that is a East China Sea and Japan. So any crisis around the Senkaku Islands or attacks affecting any U.S. bases in Japan could pull Tokyo directly into the fight. And since Japan is the operational backbone of U.S. forward posture in the Western Pacific, that's the vector. So if Chinese missiles hit U.S. facilities in Japan, the war becomes U.S., China, and Japan from day one. There's a cyber and a space escalation, and this is a nightmare. Chinese cyber operations against the United States, against our infrastructure, ports, telecommunications, logistics, finance, satellites, all, and our military networks, all could be intended as coercive signaling, but interpreted as preparation for war. It's up to us. That same annual threat assessment states that cyber actors from China and others will continue to pose critical threats to the United States networks and critical infrastructure, and that China and Russia are developing counterspace capabilities to challenge our space dominance. And some of those we have talked about, right? The hunter-killer satellites that the Russians have been deploying and have been using. We've talked about a couple of those. There's other things that are on the escalation ladder, and it could become the match in a room already full of fuel. So looking at the dime analysis, China would definitely try to split the United States alliance before any first strike. Their objective is very, very simple. You want to isolate Washington, intimidate a lot of our regional partners. You would put tremendous pressure on Europe to try and stay neutral. And then you frame the conflict as a sovereignty issue. And Taiwan is ours. It's got nothing to do with you guys. Fuck off. I think China would definitely use the United Nations, BRICS, the Global South, a lot of economic partners, and a lot of bilateral pressure, all to argue that the U.S. is the destabilizing outside force. And not us, right? Not China. Our U.S. diplomatic objective would be completely opposite. We would want to preserve coalition access. You want to keep Japan and Australia very firm, pull the Philippines into logistical and basing support. You want to keep South Korea from sitting out entirely. And here's a hard one. Prevent European neutrality. Because that could become a Chinese leverage point. Oh, let's not forget India. You want to keep India at least strategically aligned, even if not militarily aligned. And that's a tough one. The current diplomatic environment, it's already unstable. Xi warned Trump during the summit that mishandling Taiwan could put the relationship in a dangerous place, all while Taiwan has pressed the case that U.S. arms sales remain central to deterrence. So don't think that diplomacy is going to disappear in wartime. It's not. It's just going to become another battle space. China is going to say Taiwan is internal, that the United States is interfering. Asian states should not be dragged into American war. And economic stability requires neutrality. On the U.S. side, we would probably say China changed the status quo by force, that freedom of navigation and democratic self-defense are at stake. Alliance credibility is on the line. We have a very poor alliance as it is with a lot of our partners. Global coercion, we would say, must be punished, which is what they would do in any scenario involving Taiwan. The decisive diplomatic variable here is Japan. If Japan grants full operational access and participates actively, China's problem gets much, much harder. If Japan hesitates, the United States operations become much more brittle. Information would be key. I think China would aim to convince Taiwan that resistance is futile, as I mentioned, convince the Americans that war is not worth it, convince the allies that the U.S. will drag them into disaster. Not hard these days to convince anybody of that. And then convince the global South that the conflict is just another U.S. manufactured crisis. The Pentagon's 2025 China report, it describes Beijing's use of coercion, lawfare, economic pressure, and Taiwan pressure campaigns, including increased military activity around Taiwan from 2020 to 2024, and joint sword exercises, all meant to signal punishment and readiness. China's narratives on the information side is that Taiwan is abandoned, the U.S. will trade Taiwanese lives for semiconductor access, that Japan and the Philippines will become battlefields because of Washington. They're definitely going to push the China seeks reunification. America seeks containment. All of this is psychological warfare, and it's going to be repeated over and over and over again. They will probably tout that the U.S. economy cannot survive a Pacific War. It can. You'd be surprised. U.S. and Taiwanese messaging would need to counter with proof of resilience. So they'd have to show that the ports are still functioning, that the leadership is still alive, that all of their air defenses are operating, that, in fact, the allies are unified and China is paying escalation costs. But it doesn't matter because truth alone is not going to win the information fight. Visible competence will. If Taiwan's government looks paralyzed or U.S. policy looks transactional, it is. Beijing's psychological campaign, it's going to grow. In fact, recent news has already shown this vulnerability. When the Associated Press reported about the Taiwanese arms sales being a negotiating chip and anxiety in Taiwan was raised. All of this is suggested that Taiwan could be treated as leverage. Any U.S.-Chinese war would be a contest of straight-up denial, not conquest. China would try to deny U.S. access to the Western Pacific. The United States would try to deny China the ability to coerce or seize Taiwan, and Taiwan would try to deny China any quick political or military victory. The Japanese and the Philippines would become geography that matters almost as much as firepower. There's a couple phases that any conflict would take place, and I still kind of feel like we're in one of them right now. The phase 0, a lot of your shaping, your gray zone pressure, I think is taking place already. China intensifying air and maritime operations, cyber, disinformation, economic, legal, military militia, maritime militia. I think all of that is currently ongoing, and I think we're already in, phase 0. Taiwan faces a lot of persistent Chinese activity, near daily, and I don't want to risk repeating myself because a lot of these phases and a lot of these activities are very similar to the last segment when we talked about the history of Taiwan and we laid out some of the groundwork. So let's skip to a couple of the later phases. This is something that I would anticipate seeing towards the latter half of this year and the beginning of next year if my version of events plays out. I think if Beijing is preparing for a major action, you're going to see a lot of indicators. You're going to see a surge in sea lift preparation, a lot of blood supplies, their missile force being dispersed a lot more, a lot of air defense activation, cyber prepositioning, propaganda hardening, and they're going to evacuate key citizens. Those indicators are very easy to spot. They're not subtle. I think that it would telegraph a lot of the intentions. But, we watched Russian forces build up on the border of Ukraine, and the United States shouted about it, and we had cried wolf too many times before and nobody listened. But RAND's 2025 economic deterrence report specifically examined a scenario where China appeared likely to blockade or invade Taiwan within 3 to 6 months. All of it was focused on how the United States, Australia, Japan, and the UK might employ economic measures to deter a lot of this aggression. This is where deterrence either works or it doesn't. Phase 2, opening strikes, and if war starts, I think China would likely seek a very early paralysis. They're going to target things we talked about: Taiwanese command networks, air defenses, runways, naval facilities, radars, all the targets that you would expect in a target package. If Beijing believes the United States intervention is imminent, I think China would probably try to blind or confuse, delay, and overwhelm before U.S. forces can mass. Phase 3, maritime. Well, it would involve maritime, but it would also involve the Air Force. Air Force's agile combat employment concept. It would distribute, in order to survive, a lot of our combat power within the Indo-Pacific, dispersing aircraft, dispersing operations. All of this helps complicate enemy targeting. It preserves a lot of our air power. If Taiwan can survive the first shock, if U.S. and allied bases keep operating under a missile attack, can our submarines and long-range fires attrit a lot of these Chinese naval forces? These are all unknowns. Can China sustain a blockade or invasion under heavy losses? Can the United States resupply across the Pacific faster than China can close the battle space? Can both sides avoid strikes that trigger nuclear escalation? Kind of takes us into phase 4, protraction. If China does not win fast, then time becomes dangerous for everyone. A prolonged war is going to definitely test the United States munitions inventories. We've seen that now. Our ability to repair ships, our industrial capacity, not to mention sea lift, airlift, and basically public will. It's definitely going to test China's economy and their domestic stability and their ability to sustain losses under censorship, but they don't have as much to lose in the censorship realm or in the public support realm than we do. So this is where war either burns itself down through negotiation or climbs the ladder. Any strikes on mainland China, attacks on Guam, cyber attacks on the U.S., counter space attacks, blockade expansion, energy disruption, and nuclear signaling. The Brookings Institute warned earlier this year that a Taiwan war would be expensive, deadly, and carry nuclear escalation risk, even if the United States prevailed. And that's a sentence that a lot of people avoid because it tends to ruin the fantasy, because even winning could be catastrophic. Economically, any U.S.-China war would be a global cardiac event. We talked about Taiwan being central to semiconductors, but China is central to global manufacturing. And this whole thing is something that I asked Dr. Moore to explain. I wasn't so much concerned about the mechanics of a Chinese-American shooting match, because I think most of us can figure that out. Well, what I wanted to know more about was what the world looks like post Taiwan. Considering that China is central to global manufacturing, considering that Taiwan is the world leader in semiconductor, and the United States economy is a juggernaut, what happens to alliances and socioeconomic and geopolitical in a post-Taiwan? So I don't know. But the U.S., I mean, we're central to a lot of finance. We're able to sanction energy security, military logistics. Any war would hit a lot of things at the same time: chips, shipping, insurance, ports, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, rare earths, batteries, artificial intelligence, data centers, cloud infrastructure, all that. The U.S. intelligence community assessed that a China-Taiwan conflict would disrupt U.S. access to trade, semiconductor technology, all critical to the global economy, and that even without U.S. military involvement, global economic and security interests would face huge consequences. The Rhodium Group estimated that a Taiwan conflict would put well over $2 trillion in economic activity at risk before even counting sanctions or military response. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis published a 2025 analysis examining the likely economic effects of a Chinese invasion or blockade of Taiwan for the U.S. and the world economy. It noted the lack of close historical precedent because of Taiwan's importance to global technological supply chains. It's basically, it's unmeasurable what the economic impact of a conflict would be. All right. There's a lot of other second and third order effects here. I don't want to go through them all because some of these are self-evident. Food security, youth unemployment, sanctions exposure, shipping. There's vulnerabilities. There's vulnerabilities on the United States side. There's vulnerabilities on the Chinese side. There would be a massive economic war just as much as there would be a shooting war. There would be resources that would be held for ransom, like China owns the bulk of rare earth minerals in the world, 90% for all intents and purposes. Yeah, that would be completely blocked off. It wouldn't be a regional war. It would be global, at least on the economic front. We've talked a lot about US and we've talked a lot about China and we've talked a lot about Taiwan. There's a lot of other players. There's Australia, there's South Korea, and I think South Korea's involvement in any US-China conflict would be very complicated because Seoul's first concern is North Korea. China and North Korea could exploit a Taiwan crisis to easily pin down U.S. attention. South Korea may support politically and logistically, but would be very cautious about becoming a direct combatant. Europe in any conflict would mostly matter economically, diplomatically, industrially, and a lot through sanctions. But I don't think any direct military contribution would be limited. Sorry, I do think any direct military contribution would be limited compared with the Indo-Pacific allies. India would likely avoid any formal combat, but could very easily complicate China's strategic picture along the Himalayas and the Indian Ocean. I think a lot of its role would be pressure, not alliance warfare. There's many rungs to this escalation ladder between the United States and China. Many. We talked about gray zone pressure at the bottom, cyber and maritime, followed by quarantine or a blockade. Then you've got warning shots, maybe some vessel seizures, a lot of air interceptions. Rung 4, you're looking at a missile strike directly on Taiwan, followed by U.S. and allied intervention. Then Chinese strikes on U.S. regional bases. U.S. would strike back on PLA assets that support the campaign wherever they lie. Followed by cyber attacks on homeland infrastructure. Rung 9, you have counter space attacks. There's surface-to-air missiles that could hit satellites in space, and we have no idea what Chinese anti-satellite missiles are looking like or what they already have in geosynchronous or low Earth. Rung 10, you've got attacks on Guam, Japan-based facilities, or wider maritime traffic. Rung 11, nuclear signaling. 12, tactical nuclear fear threshold. The worst. The key escalation problem here is China may see strikes on mainland-based assets as necessary for U.S. operational success, but also as an unacceptable escalation, where the U.S. may see Chinese strikes on U.S. bases as acts of war, but China may see them as necessary to keep America out. So, both sides can be defensive in their own minds while both are climbing towards disaster. What does this imply for the United States? Any deterrence has to be visible long before the crisis. The United States cannot improve deterrence after China starts moving. So munitions, basing rights, fuel, repair capacity, a lot of these distributed command, any exercises with allies, submarine readiness, missile defense. It has to exist beforehand, not after, not during the crisis. Taiwan, don't treat Taiwan as a bargaining chip. So I think that one kind of goes without saying, but man, I'll tell you what, the administration is never boring. Referring to Taiwan as a bargaining chip is really strategic malpractice. Ambiguity deters. Transactional confusion, that invites testing. If China believes Washington might trade Taiwan for economics or Iran cooperation or trade concessions or domestic political optics, all of that deterrence that we've built up, it totally weakens. In fact, it kind of goes away. The U.S. industrial base is another warfighting variable. Any Pacific war would earn precision munitions, interceptors, drones, spare parts, missiles, naval repair capacity at a rate the current system may struggle to replace. We are struggling now. The Economic Report 2026, the chapter on the defense industrial base, it warned that expanding and strengthening the U.S. defense industrial base is necessary to meet China as this pacing challenge increases. Cyber defense is homeland defense. A war would not just stay over there. Our ports here at home, our rails, our telecoms, finance, energy, hospitals, all would be under attack. Our threat assessment specifically warns that China and a lot of other actors pose some serious critical threats to our network and our critical infrastructure. If China believes that the United States public here domestically can't tolerate inflation or market shock, then Beijing has leverage. It doesn't just mean they need carriers or missiles. It's a lot of our public stamina. And Americans are fickle. We are. We'll wave the flag one day and we'll roll it up the next. We need to stop pretending every theater is equally resourced. A major war with China while the U.S. is heavily committed in the Middle East or Europe would absolutely stress our forces. And the U.S. can be global. We can, but we can't be infinite. And I think we need to accept that and manage some expectations here. There's more to it than this, but I don't want to beat the horse too badly. And we might revisit this thought experiment again. So the bottom line to this story, I think, is this. A U.S.-China war would likely begin over Taiwan, but the real fight would be over regional order, alliance credibility, coercive power, technological control, and whether the first island chain becomes a Chinese security perimeter or remains contested space. China's cleanest victory is not an invasion. It is Taiwan losing faith before the U.S. acts. America's cleanest victory is not defeating China in a long war. It is making the first move look unwinnable to Beijing. The battlefield, it's already being prepared. Diplomacy, information, warfare, cyber access, maritime, legal positioning, and modernization. The shooting has not started, but the shaping fight, it's already underway. Some caveats to this story. The intelligence community has said that China does not appear to have a fixed invasion timeline and does not currently plan to invade Taiwan in 2027. That does not mean low risk. It means the risk is conditional. A blockade is more likely than a full invasion, but a blockade can still become a major war fast. The biggest blind spot in public analysis is always escalation control. Everyone talks about winning. Not enough people talk about how to stop the war once both sides have bled, sunk ships, dead pilots, damaged satellites, and domestic audiences demanding punishment. Well, that sounds a lot like Iran, doesn't it? Okay. We talked about a story a couple of weeks back involving, actually, this goes back a couple of months, involving the United States agreeing to provide the Australian Navy with nuke-powered fast attack boats. It would analogous would be to our LA class subs, maybe a little bit bigger. And it is a joint venture between the United Kingdom, Australia, and the U.S. And the acronym that has been coined is AUKUS, AUKUS, Australia, UK, US, AUKUS submarine collaboration. The timeline is slipping pretty drastically on this. There was supposed to have been submarines already delivered and then 2 per year up until 2050, something like that. But, okay, let me paint the picture. AUKUS is not just a submarine deal. So understand that. This is the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia all trying to weld 3 defense industry systems into one undersea warfighting machine, all before China changes the map. You're seeing a theme here. I know you are. So that's the mission. It's a big one. Australia wants nuclear-powered attack submarines, not nuclear-armed, nuclear-powered, which is a big difference. These boats are built to stay submerged. They move very fast. They travel very far. They're very quiet. And they cause a lot of adversaries some bad night sleeps. This all matters because the Indo-Pacific is not a backyard pond. This is a massive operating environment with very long distances, very deep water, a lot of choke points, a lot of island chains, and a Chinese Navy that has been building like it knows exactly what decades it wants to fight in. Now, don't discount a diesel boat. They can be lethal. But a nuclear-powered attack submarine can be lethal for a lot longer, a lot farther from home, and in places where the enemy doesn't want it to be. And that's why AUKUS matters. But there's a problem here. The strategy is strong, but the timeline on this thing is super ugly. Under AUKUS, Australia is supposed to move through a very linear staged pathway. First, more United States and United Kingdom submarine visits. Second, rotational deployment of U.S. and British nuclear-powered submarines out of Western Australia under Submarine Rotational Force West. Third, Australia buys several U.S. Virginia class. Okay, I misspoke. I had said that it was LA class, analogous to, my mistake, closer to the Virginia class submarines in the late 2030s. Fourth, Australia and the UK eventually field the new SSN AUKUS class, with the United Kingdom getting boats first in the late 2030s and Australia following in the early 2040s. So that's the official roadmap. It's great. Everybody agreed to it. It was supposed to be clean, but it's not. It's not clean. Mostly because submarines don't matriculate out of PowerPoint slides. They come out of shipyards. And that's the problem, because right now, the United States is not building Virginia-class submarines fast enough. We have a shipbuilding problem in the United States. Right now, the U.S. needs them for its own fleet. And there was a news story that was out a couple of weeks ago, basically telling Australia, about those submarines that you wanted, you're going to have to wait a lot longer for them than we initially agreed. Australia needs these submarines as a bridge capability. The Navy needs to maintain deterrence now, not in some future brochure, but our production way below target. And this means that every submarine sent to Australia creates a question. Are we strengthening the alliance, or are we robbing Peter to arm Paul? And that's not a political talking point. This is straight up math, and math does not care about speeches. We're not alone. The UK problem has its own strain. Barrow and Furness is the center of gravity for British submarine construction. And that yard has to support the future SSN AUKUS class, while the Royal Navy is already under pressure. The UK needs workers. It needs engineers, welders, nuclear specialists, cleared labor, housing, transport, local infrastructure, long-term funding. That's the unsexy part of deterrence, folks. Everybody wants the submarine. Nobody wants to talk about the guy welding pressure hull sections in a town that cannot house the workforce. But that guy is the problem. No workforce, no boat. No boat, no deterrence. Australians have a problem too. They are being asked to build a nuke sub enterprise almost from scratch. Not a nuclear weapons program, a nuclear stewardship culture. That means you have to train crews, build maintenance facilities, creating regulators, managing waste, securing ports, handling emergency response, and convincing the public that this is safe, sovereign, and worth the money. And there's a lot of money. And that's a generational lift. I mean, Australia gets a seat at the high table, but the bill is enormous. And the strategic innocence is gone. Once you host US and UK nuclear-powered submarines, once your ports become part of Allied undersea posture, once your territory becomes a sustainment node in the Indo-Pacific fight, you are not just watching the great power game. You're on the board, buddy. And if you're on the board, you can be targeted. That's the price of relevance. China sees AUKUS for what it is, a maritime containment architecture. Beijing will call it destabilizing. It will call it proliferation. It will call Australia a U.S. proxy. It will push that line through the United Nations, through Pacific Island diplomacy, through regional media, through influence operations, and through every forum where nuclear scares people. Now, some of that is propaganda. Some of that is strategic signaling. And some of it is not completely imaginary. AUKUS does create a precedent. A non-nuclear weapons state receiving naval nuclear propulsion technology from nuclear weapon states. That is legally manageable, but politically it's very sensitive. And China is going to exploit that. I count on it. Count on it. If AUKUS works, it gives the Allied side a deeper undersea network across the Indo-Pacific. That's good. That means more survivable platforms, more ambiguity for Chinese planners, more pressure on Chinese naval movements. It gives more risk to Chinese surface combatants, their amphib groups, their logistic lines, their blockade concepts. In a Taiwan scenario, that matters. In a South China Sea crisis, that matters. In the Indian Ocean, that matters. A submarine does not need to fire a weapon to affect enemy planning. That's one of the beautiful things about it. Its possible presence changes behavior. It's called deterrence, and it's working. It's a knife in the dark. But there is a strategic gap. Australia's sovereign nuclear submarine capability arrives late, too late to solve the immediate problem. Right now, the dangerous window is in the late 2020s into the 2030s. And I don't think China is waiting politely for Australia to finish workforce development. So the real near-term value of AUKUS is not Australian-owned submarines, not yet anyway. The real near-term value is rotational US and UK presence out of Western Australia. It's the training pipelines, the allied integration, the port infrastructure, and industrial mobilization. That's the bridge. But bridges can fail if the foundations are weak. And the foundation here is industrial capacity. The industrial base, both here and in the United Kingdom, is the center of gravity. This entire pact lives or dies in shipyards, not summit rooms, not communiques, not white papers, shipyards. Can the United States build enough Virginia-class submarines? I would say no, not currently. Can the United Kingdom deliver SSN AUKUS while sustaining its own fleet? That's a great question. I don't know. Can Australia build the workforce and nuclear culture fast enough? It's another unknown. Well, known unknown, I should say. Can three democracies maintain funding and discipline across elections, scandals, budget fights, and public anxiety? The bill for these, it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars. That's the real fight. This fight that is in the planning stage. It's not glamorous. It is steel. It's labor, contracts, training, security clearances, housing, nuclear regulation, and of course, time, mostly time. And time is the one thing the Indo-Pacific may not give us. The risk here is production shortfall. If U.S. submarine production does not increase, the Virginia transfer becomes politically and militarily painful. Political backlash is another risk. Australia is spending huge money before the public sees a sovereign submarine, and that creates a lot of targets for criticism. There's a third risk, and that's nuclear waste and the public trust. If Australia cannot explain the waste plan clearly, the opposition is going to fill the vacuum. The risk 4 is the United Kingdom capacity. Barrow has to perform. If Barrow slips, then SSN AUKUS slips. There's a China risk here. Let's call it risk 5. China's not going to sit still. Expect more anti-submarine warfare, seabed surveillance, cyber targeting of shipyards, unmanned underwater systems, and political warfare. I would say the last risk would be exquisite platform addiction. AUKUS cannot become a sacred temple to expensive submarines, while the near-term fight calls for missiles and drones and mines and air defense and hardened bases and fuel storage and logistics. That's the blind spot. Submarines matter, and they matter a lot. They're part of the triad, but submarines alone do not make a denial strategy. All of this implies that AUKUS tells us the Allies understand one thing very, very clearly. If you look in between the lines, the next major Indo-Pacific fight may be decided below the surface before the first headline hits. Undersea dominance, it's not an option. It is survival. But AUKUS also tells us something very uncomfortable, that the West is trying to deter a fast-moving threat with a very slow-moving industrial system. China is building pressure every year. AUKUS delivers full capability over decades, and that mismatch is dangerous. So, folks, the task here is very simple and it's very brutal. We have to accelerate the industrial base. We have to protect our shipyards. We have to train the workforce, harden the bases, solve the waste issue, build the missile and drone layer, and it has to be built now. You can use this United States and United Kingdom rotations to cover the gap. I got it. But stop pretending strategy is real until the supply chain can carry it. The bottom line is that AUKUS is the right idea, but the right idea executed late becomes a monument, not a weapon. The submarine collaboration gives Australia reach. It gives this alliance that we have a lot of depth. And frankly, it gives China another problem to solve, which I'm happy to give them. It also gives the Indo-Pacific a stronger deterrent architecture, but only if the three nations can build what they actually promised. And right now, the enemy gets a vote. The shipyard gets a vote. Hell, the voters get a vote. That clock is running. Yeah. A couple of caveats. The biggest uncertainty is not submarine technology. It is political endurance and industrial throughput. AUKUS fails or succeeds much less in the ocean than it does in the shipyards and the budget and the workforce pipeline and, frankly, the public trust. Okay. So that's the AUKUS update. I will continue to sprinkle that story when I feel it's appropriate. That is the third story we have done on the subject to kind of track this. We'll circle back. So let me brief everyone on the Nigerian ISIS operation. It killed a high-ranking ISIS official, Abu Bilal. He goes by a couple of different names. The chances are pretty good I'm going to mispronounce all of them. Would everybody be okay if I just referred to him by his first name, Abu Bilal? Because I feel comfortable saying that one and it rolls off the 10 nicely, right? So it's a big counterterrorism win, but I don't want to oversell it. This is not a ISIS is crippled. The strike did remove a very senior ISIS West Africa global network facilitator. Now, he appears to have sat right on the seam between a local insurgency and global command. He was a guy that was a facilitator, so connected media, finance, weapons development, regional coordination. Now, the successful termination, kill, whatever word you want to use, right? It does prove a alliance between U.S. and Niger, their counterterrorism cooperation. Heretofore, it was a lot of advisory support. Now it's back towards kinetic partnership. I don't have a problem with this one. Anytime somebody like this is taken off the board, it's good for everyone. It signals that Africa is no longer a side theater for ISIS. It's now one of the main theaters, and that's kind of new in this particular campaign. And that brings us to our Nigerian ISIS operation story. So the United States operation that killed Abu Bilal, and I am not going to pronounce his last name. He has three nom de guerres. I'm not going to murder his last name. I'm just going to call him Abu Bilal. He was a high-ranking ISIS individual, huge counterterrorism win, but I don't want anyone to misread this as ISIS is crippled, because that is not at all what this story implies. He was a senior ISIS West Africa global network facilitator. He appears to have sat at the seam between local insurgency and ISIS global command. He also controlled media, finance, weapons development, and regional coordination. So It does prove U.S. Nigeria counterterrorism cooperation has moved from advisory support back towards kinetic partnership. We've spoken about U.S. Special Operations Forces and military in general in Nigeria helping as an advisor. It signals that Africa is really no longer a side theater for ISIS. It's now one of the main theaters. Reuters reporting that Trump and Nigerian President Bola Tinubu said Al-Muniki, I said his last name, don't know if it's right, was killed in northeastern Nigeria, with the Nigerian army placing the operation in Borneo State. They describe it as a precision air-land operation coordinated with AFRICOM, running roughly 12:01 a.m. to 4 a.m. Saturday. No reported friendly casualties or asset losses, which is fantastic, right? So what happened? This individual was killed in a joint U.S.-Nigerian operation in the Lake Chad Basin. This is the old Boko Haram ice swap battle space. So it spans Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. Tinubu said Al-Maliki was killed along with several lieutenants during a strike on his compound. AFRICOM's public framing, as quoted by Long War Journal, identifies this individual as ISIS's director of global operations and the ISIS number 2. It was a great win. AFRICOM's initial assessment was that multiple terrorists, including the individual and other senior ISIS leaders, were all killed. The Nigerian side is defending the claim aggressively because there apparently had been prior confusion about whether he had already been killed in 2024 or not. The Nigerian State House says the earlier claim was mistaken identity or misattribution, and that the latest operation followed months of ISR communications monitoring, phone intercepts, human intelligence, all beginning around December of 2025. So I want to tell you a little bit more about who this guy is. So not just another local Bush commander. The U.S. State Department formally designated Abu Bakr ibn Muhammad ibn Ali. Guy's got a lot of names, okay? It's got a lot of names. Why can't you just have one? It makes it much easier to refer to you when it's a single first name. I'm sorry. Was that cultural insensitivity? I don't give a fuck. Aber Manoik, he's got a lot of names. He's been designated as a global terrorist in June of 2023, all identifying him as a leader of ISIS. Associated Press reports that he was born in 1982. Borneo became a key ISWAP commander after the Boko Haram split and was linked by Nigerian officials to ISIS media operations, finance, as well as weapons development. Associated Press also notes that the claim that he was literally ISIS's global number 2 has been disputed by some analysts. I don't know who those analysts are. I'm going to look into that a little bit more. That caveat matters, though. Long War's Journal read is much more disciplined. They say that Al-Minuki had not previously been publicly identified as ISIS's global deputy, but UN-linked reporting had identified him as head of ISIS's Al-Farqoun office, which helps manage ISIS activity across the Sahel, wider West Africa, North Africa, Sudan. So some states reportedly believed he may have risen to head ISIS's General Directorate of Provinces, which I want to make sure I've got this right. I'm clearly not spelling names, which would put him in the top tier of ISIS's global leadership. So I don't know if we're going to do a dime analysis with every story, but let's try rolling one out with this one and seeing how well it plays. Diplomacy. This is a reset point, I would say, in the U.S.-Nigeria relations. So the relationship had been strained in recent months by U.S. criticism of Nigeria's handling of the Islamic violence and allegation about anti-Christian targeting. If you remember, we talked about that story a while back where it was widely believed that somebody very close to the president had told him that there was targeted Christian killings in that country. Trump did speak out publicly against that government in Nigeria. Of course, they denied it. Nigeria said they were doing everything that they could. Interesting story. We talked about that quite extensively, so we won't rehash it. Reuters notes Washington had increased drones, deployed about 200 troops for training and intelligence support, all after earlier December of last year strikes, while Nigerian officials had described U.S. personnel as non-combatant support. And they were, intelligence advisors, but it shifted. And it's potentially shifted towards the positive. The implication in what's taking place is that Nigeria accepted a lot more U.S. help because the threat exceeded its organic targeting capacity, which most countries, that happens. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Abuja gets legitimacy, ISR, and precision reach. Washington gets renewed access in West Africa after the U.S. lost strategic depth elsewhere in the Sahel. The messaging here is doing double duty. Trump is framing this as decisive counterterrorism leadership. Tinubu frames it as a sovereign partnership. And it's also proof that Nigerian forces can hit senior jihadist leadership. ISIS is likely going to frame it as martyrdom, shocker, and use it to recruit. The information in this is a fight, and it's not secondary here. In jihadist networks, leadership deaths become either disruption or myth, depending on whether the follow-on pressure is sustained. One clean strike without follow-up, it just becomes a poster. A clean strike followed by network dismantling, that becomes a fracture. Moving over to military. Militarily, it's a high-value target removal. It's not a campaign victory. It likely disrupts ISWAP ISIS coordination in the short term, especially if his lieutenants and a lot of the devices were hit or captured. Looks like they had. AP is citing analysts saying the strike can disrupt finance, recruitment, and planning at the provincial level, but only if precision strikes and their targeting are sustained. It does show that the United States ISR signals intelligence and target development, as well as the Nigerian ground access, can produce a lot of actionable effects in the Lake Chad Basin. I think that matters because that's a brutal terrain. I've not been to that specific location, but I'm familiar with the topography. You've got forested zones, you have islands, a lot of porous borders. There's a lot of sympathetic or coerced, read that as you will, local networks, and a militant taxation system. Economics, ISIS in West Africa is not just fighting, it also governs, it taxes, it extorts, recruits, smuggles, and monetizes insecurity. So when you kill a senior finance / media / weapons node, it can interrupt the flow of money and messaging and technical know-how, especially when it comes to drones, explosives, and manufactured weapons. But the root economy still remains. You have weak state presence, displaced populations. It's not a very well-off place. Cross-border smuggling, cattle and fishing, farming taxation, a shitload of kidnappings, which we've talked about, unfortunately, all too much, and a lot of local protection rackets. CFR's latest Shahil tracker warns that violent extremists organizations are using the regional security vacuum to expand. So ISWAP among the groups exploiting instability. What does it imply for us, for the United States? Well, first, Africa is back on the U.S. counterterrorism board. We've missed you. And this is not symbolically. This is operationally. The old assumption that ISIS's center of gravity is Iraq or Syria. That's outdated. There's not a lot left in those. The ISIS's survivability, it really depends on its provinces, heavily on its provinces, especially Africa. The other thing, secondly, that it is saying is that AFRICOM is trying to rebuild reach after Sahel access problem with Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso drifting away from Western security. So Nigeria becoming more important. It's good. It's a good thing. A successful joint strike like this, it also gives Washington a proof point. It says, we can still hunt here. I mean, fuck, who are we kidding? You can hunt anywhere. Oh, excuse me. Third, this is a pretty loud message to ISIS leadership saying that Africa is no longer sanctuary. That matters in many ways because ISIS has increasingly used a lot of regional offices to push money and media and operational guidance across a lot of these African provinces. If you take away a lot of the connective tissue and you degrade global coherence, even if local fighters remain, that's good. Fourth, this does not solve Nigeria's insurgency problem here. So again, I don't want to confuse decapitation with stabilization. ISWAP survives because it has a lot of things going for them. It has terrain and revenue and social penetration. It has a lot of state weakness to feed on. One dead commander does not repair governance in Borno. It doesn't secure Lake Chad, and it certainly doesn't stop recruitment. Fifth, the United States is accepting more counterterrorism risk when they do this. We are already stretched globally. We are, with pressure points in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East, in Europe, homeland security. A lot of kinetic activity in Africa adds to an operational burden, and it may be necessary. I'm not saying it isn't. What I'm saying is it's not free. We're stretched pretty thin. Just stating a fact. The strike matters because this guy appears to have been a connector, not just a fighter. And connectors are dangerous. They move money, they move doctrine, media, technology, and orders. Connectors turn isolated insurgencies into a network system, and that's really critical strategically. But here's a blind spot in the victory lap, which is ISIS does not need one irreplaceable genius. It needs permissive terrain, weak states, corrupt security structures, and hungry young men with no future. And Africa still has all four of those things. So the U.S. and Nigeria took a strong shot, which is great. But if we do not follow this up with persistent ISR, a lot of border pressure, financial targeting, and local intelligence penetration, ISIS is going to bury him, mythologize him, replace him, and basically keep moving. So, yeah, bottom line, operationally, major tactical success. Strategically, I would say meaningful, but not decisive. Politically, U.S. Nigerian counterterrorism cooperation is warming fast, and that is a good thing. Any relationships that result in the removal of these people from the battlefield, I am all for. Geopolitically, Africa is becoming a primary ISIS battle space. There's some risks here, though. You risk ISIS and ISWAP retaliatory attacks, a lot of propaganda exploitation, and you risk leadership succession. The opportunity here, though, is you exploit the disruption window before they reconstitute. So we'll see. We'll keep an eye on this story. I like the fact that this is progressing in the direction that it is. There are some concerns. Can we exploit the victory? Are we stretching ourselves too thin? Remains to be seen. We'll continue to follow up on it. A couple of caveats on this one. The Islamic State has not publicly confirmed his death in the sources that I found, although Nigerian officials acknowledged prior mistaken reporting about his death. They now claim a much higher confidence that this time he really was killed and it really was the guy. The operation's long-term effect depends entirely on whether follow-on exploitation occurred. So captured devices, courier networks, financial trails, safe house mapping, and detention of facilitators. Without that, it's a clean kill, not a strategic rupture. That brings us to our last story for the evening. I would like to share a little bit about Turkey's new STM-built extra-large unmanned underwater vehicle, or XLUUV or XLUV. It sounds like a sex toy, I'm not going to lie. But this is not just another underwater drone. It is a signal that the submarine mission set is being unbundled. This is a pretty interesting piece of tech. And what's even more interesting is who's building it and how and where. So ISR, seabed mapping, mine warfare, infrastructure inspection, torpedo carriage, electronic warfare, decoying, and mothership deployment of smaller unmanned systems are all being pushed into cheaper, expendable, autonomous hulls. I don't think there is a ceiling to the drone escalation right now. All of this matters because the undersea fight is becoming what the air war became after drones arrived. Distributed, persistent, cheaper, harder to attribute, and much harder to defend against. So Tengiz is STM. Tengiz is made by STM. It was unveiled at the Saha Expo this year as the largest member of its autonomous underwater unmanned vehicle family. STM describes it as a high autonomy XLUV designed for tactical, operational, and strategic missions, all without an onboard operator. It's built around modular sections, which are pretty cool. So you have sensors, you have energy units, you have propulsion, you have communications, can carry mission payloads, weapons, and then even smaller submarine UUVs. So it can serve as a mothership. STM says Tengiz can perform ISR, target tracking, ASW, barrier patrol, that's anti-submarine warfare, by the way, EW, or electronic warfare, SIGINT, signals intelligence, seabed mapping. It can do undersea infrastructure inspection, which is pretty cool, right? That's a peacetime application. Offensive mine warfare by deploying mines in transit routes, frightening. It is also described as capable of launching heavy and very light torpedoes, carrying STM's NITA 300 autonomous underwater vehicle, and deploying the ALPA GUT smart loitering munition from depth. So that's at depth. That's pretty cool. 40-foot container capability. It's not a small detail. That is a huge procurement and logistics tell. It means STM is trying to make the vehicle transportable through ordinary military logistics channels, rather than tying it to some kind of specialized submarine infrastructure where it needs an even bigger mothership to launch. Naval News and STM both identify launch options that include ports, logistics support vehicles, and well-deck ships. So those are your amphib ships. The real significance here is that Tengiz is a submarine mission surrogate. It's not a submarine replacement. So I think that distinction matters. A manned submarine is still superior in so many ways, in judgment, endurance, payload diversity, survivability, as well as command discretion. But a manned submarine is also very expensive. They're very scarce. They can be politically sensitive. And as I pointed out in the last story, they're very slow to build. This guy right here, this Tengiz, points towards a completely different model. You put an unmanned hull in the water to do the dirty and the dull work, the dangerous work, the deniable work, before you risk a crewed boat. I think this is potentially the future of maritime pattern. I mean, we're seeing unmanned aerial systems, the first-person drones, the AI-powered wingman that the Air Force is looking at, and other services. And now you have a counterpart all underneath. Crewed submarines become command nodes and premium shooters. X-Loves become the scouts, the miners, decoys, the sensor trucks, the forward loitering weapons carriers. And that changes a lot of the acquisitions math, because now a Navy no longer needs to buy only exquisite platforms. It can buy a layered undersea force. You have crewed submarines, and then below that, the X-Loves, and then the medium UAVs, the seabed sensors, and then surface drones, loitering munitions, and shore-based command systems. NATO's ongoing Allied Underwater Battlespace Mission Network project, huge, right? I know you guys are all following this. It's pointed in the same direction. Interoperability between crewed and uncrewed systems, both above, on, and below the water, all with secure information exchange across the underwater battle space. If it wasn't so frightening, I'd be really excited for future war if I could sit back and watch it in purely a spectator's position instead of at least, well, I think we're all going to be impacted by it. What missions that this system enables? Well, there's a few. And I think that is definitely going to change the way that we operate subsurface. You've got persistent ISR without burning submarine days. So right now, the most immediate value is persistent underwater surveillance. But a manned submarine used for ISR, that's a premium asset. You don't send that to sit and listen in a choke point or an approach lane or a harbor mouth or a cable route or even a suspected submarine transit corridor, because that consumes a very scarce hull availability. So now Tengiz gives a Navy a way to park sensors forward for weeks. I mean, it's the undersea equivalent of a drone flying for weeks at a time over the battlefield. This has more than 20 days endurance and more than 400 meter operating depth. It's built for a lot of patient work, listening, mapping, tracking, and reporting. So from a procurement implication, navies will increasingly buy a lot of these undersea persistence as a consumable service, not just as a submarine function. The other thing you can do is offensive mine warfare. And I think this is something that we haven't seen in a long, long while. It's a very uncomfortable part. STM explicitly says that Tengiz can conduct offensive mine warfare by deploying mines in designated transit routes. This is nasty strategically. Mines are cheap, mine countermeasure is slow, and a minefield does not need to sink a fleet to work. It only needs to create uncertainty. Insurance rates move, port operations slow, amphibious options narrow, and a lot of commanders hesitate. And the water becomes a legal, operational, and psychological trap. Modern X-Loves make mining more flexible because the delivery platform is unmanned. It is covert. It's launched from a lot of non-traditional locations. You don't have to track subs leaving a large base. It can be pretty much launched from everywhere. It raises the gray zone problem. Who put it there? When? And from where? Number 3, undersea mothership operations. So it's advertised as a mothership for smaller systems like their own STM's Anita 300 AUV. One big vehicle like this can deploy a bunch of smaller vehicles for local searching or seabed, mine reconnaissance, cable inspection, or really distributed sensing. You've got the capability to launch a swarm all from a mothership. This is great. I mean, technologically, I'm geeking out on it, but the implications of it are frightening for our near-peer adversaries. to use on us. It's the undersea version of a drone carrier. One platform enters the battle space. You've got a bunch of smaller systems that are all leaving and spread out. Hugely complicates detection and attribution because you don't know where it's from. You don't know who owns the sensor suite. You don't know who it's reporting to. So massive leverage without needing more submarines. Number 4, you've got strike ambiguity. The reported weapons, at least reported by them, I haven't second sourced reported or verified. It's from their own media, but they're saying that Tengiz is much more than an ISR platform. It says it can launch heavy and very light torpedoes. It reports provisions for a 324 millimeter or 533 millimeter torpedo, as well as naval mines, sensors, loitering munitions, and potentially weapons compatible with standard 533 millimeter tubes. So don't overread this yet. This is public display capability. It's not the same as a fielded fleet capability, but they're moving away from sensor only towards sensor shooter platforms. This is a departure from what we've previously seen before, and that's a line that a lot of navies are crossing. How does this compare to the wider extra large UUV trend? Well, this Tengiz is part of a broad global move from what I'm reading. The U.S. Navy, for example, accepted its first Orca XLOV test asset from Boeing. This is back in 2023. NAVSEA describes Orca as an autonomous diesel-electric unmanned submarine with a modular payload capable of holding sensors, comm gear, mission-specific components. They're not saying what mission-specific components are, but this is all from their public material, by the way. Orca material emphasizes much greater range than Tengiz, advertising up to 6,500 nautical miles and months-long mission loitering time. Okay, Tengiz appears much smaller, shorter-legged, but more tactically exportable. It's 11 meters. It's 17.8 tons displacement. It is container compatible. It's designed around modular payloads and much more regional maritime operation. So for your middle power navies, that's pretty attractive. Not every country can afford nuclear submarines or a major conventional submarine fleet, but a lot of countries can justify this small containerized unmanned undersea system for, choke point defense, ISR, seabed security, or just plain deterrence. So this company is aiming this product directly at that market. The implications for modern maritime operations is that the undersea domain is going to be very crowded here very, very soon. The old undersea picture, it was pretty clean. You had submarines, mines, sonobuoys, fixed arrays, divers, and specialized mine countermeasure vessels. Now, you've got crude submarines, you have XLOVs, you have medium UUVs, disposable sensors, seabed nodes, loitering munitions, autonomous decoys, surface drones, cable threat, and AI-assisted acoustic processing. All of this creates a command and control problem. NATO's AUWBMN effort exists because the alliance knows the next fight below the waterline is going to require networked coordination between crewed and uncrewed systems, not isolated platforms. So seabed warfare, it's now mainstream. Tengiz seabed mapping and a lot of their critical infrastructure inspection role, it's not secondary, it's absolutely central. A lot of modern economies run through undersea cables or pipelines or energy nodes, ports, offshore infrastructure. So a platform that can quietly inspect, map, shadow, or when need be, interfere with seabed infrastructure, this is a major strategic asset in peacetime competition as well as crisis. The Baltic, Black Sea, Eastern Mediterranean, Red Sea approaches, Persian Gulf, South China Sea, and Taiwan approaches all become natural operating environments for exactly this kind of system. I would expect to see it in an ocean near you. Now, smaller navies get submarine-like options. This is an acquisition bombshell because a country that cannot build or sustain a large submarine force can still acquire some submarine-like effects like ISR or mine placement or barrier patrol, harbor approach surveillance, seabed reconnaissance, decoying, limited strike, infrastructure protection. You've got a litany of capabilities that a platform like this can do. Now, doesn't equal true submarine warfare dominance, but it gives a lot of middle powers leverage. It lets them impose cost, uncertainty, and risk on a lot of stronger navies. It lets them punch far above their weight. The kill chain becomes a lot harder to see because radar isn't solving this. Satellites don't solve this. Surface patrols do not solve this. Underwater detection remains brutally hard because, I don't know if you know this, but the ocean is opaque, it's noisy, it's layered, it's temperature dependent, and it's terrain-like subsurface. This means that the side that can field a very cheap, numerous autonomous undersea system can operate and create a very ugly operational problem, which is defenders may not know whether they are looking at a sensor or a decoy or a mine or a torpedo carrier or a dormant seabed asset. If you're a procurement officer, something like this hits a couple of different buying triggers. First off, it's modular. So that lowers your life cycle risk if payloads can be swapped as sensors or batteries or autonomy stacks and weapons evolve. You can change whatever needs to be changed. It's container compatible, and I really don't want to underscore that because that is massive. This simplifies transport and concealment and dispersed deployment. If it fits in a 40-foot shipping container, then it looks from a satellite or other ISR platform like a 40-foot shipping container, not an extra large underwater autonomous vehicle. This thing is multi-mission. It can do EW, SIGINT, ISR, mine, ASW, seabed work. It justifies the line item right there. It's perfectly export position. Turkey has become aggressive in unmanned systems exports, and Tengiz fits that very, very well. Lower political friction than U.S. systems. We're just going to kind of let that one sit. That's all we're going to say. And attractive capability for a lot of regional navies. Now, it is not yet proven at fleet scale. So that's the caveat here. A scale model debut and manufacturer claims are not the same as operational acceptance or sustained deployment. So hasn't been proven yet. On paper, it looks great. The model looks great. The story reads great. I don't want to get too excited, but it does add another X-Love into the context. The U.S. Navy's own unmanned campaign framework warns that unmanned systems must fit into the doctrine, organization, training, leadership, personnel, facilities, and policy, not just exist as clever hardware, much like the current fleet of UAVs and unmanned systems must. It's that is the part that a lot of industry brochures seem to understate. The platform is impressive, but the decisive issue here is not the hull, it's everything else that goes along with it. A dumb X-Love is an expensive torpedo-shaped science project, but a network X-Love tied into command and control, acoustic intelligence, seabed maps, mission planning, satellite, burst communications, or secure autonomy and rules of engagement, that becomes a warfighting asset. STM says that this is integrated with a lot of command and control. It's integrated with SATCOM for network-centric warfare. So I think it's the right direction. The real test is, can this operate when jammed or spoofed or cut off or hunted or acoustically confused or forced to make decisions in degraded comms? We'll see. It's probably going to get put to the test. I will tell you that. So the bottom line on this one is it implies 5 things for modern maritime operations. First off, submarine missions are being distributed into unmanned systems, and we are seeing that. And we are seeing that early, but that curve is going to ramp up pretty quick. Secondly, mine warfare and seabed warfare are moving back to the center of naval planning. Middle powers can now buy limited undersea deterrence without buying a full submarine fleet. That is both frightening and exciting. Navies will need new counter XLOV doctrine, as well as the sensors, the patrol patterns, and the legal authorities. Lastly, the decisive maritime fight is shifting from platform versus platform to network versus network. Tengiz is not a revolution by itself. It is evidence of the revolution, I think, already underway. The sea is getting populated by machines that do not breathe, they don't sleep, they don't panic, they don't need to be rescued, and that changes a lot of things. It makes the ocean less empty, less permissive, and far more dangerous. Some caveats on that story is, remember that manufacturer claims are not operational proof. And until we get some, that's all I'm going to say on this story. We're going to follow it up. There's no clear open source evidence yet of a confirmed Turkish Navy procurement quantity, export customer, or combat deployment for Tengiz. The public record supports capability claims and market debuts, but not fielded operational weapon systems at scale. So it matters. All right, that is our show for the week. Once again, I'd like to thank you for joining me. I hope it was informative. I hope it raised questions. And if you have questions or comments, please do not hesitate to reach out to the show. I can be emailed at contact at bradcolbert.us. That is contact at bradcolbert.us. Or just leave a comment in your favorite method of consuming the show. We do go out of our way to read those comments and answer them. I will answer as many as I possibly can. If you have something that you would like to say, just make sure that you back it up with some kind of claim. If it is nothing more than a subjective opinion, definitely I will read it and I will answer back. But how much more engaging and enjoyable would it be if we had a conversation? After all, that's what this whole endeavor is about, is having an honest conversation. And until next time, this is Brad Colbert, the Iceman, reminding all of you to stay frosty.
Improvise, adapt, and overcome.